It's really a joy to be in Lowell tonight, and I appreciate all of you all coming out in the uncertain weather. And I suppose you live close enough around that the driving here doesn't drive you crazy. But if it hadn't been for Seth yesterday, we would still be wandering around somewhere on the other side of the river. So maybe I can write, but I can't find my way around. Certainly not around Lowell. So it is a special joy to have finally gotten here. I feel as though Lyddie and I have been a part of the National Park and the History Center, well, since there was a History Center, right? And just last week in Montpelier, the Lost Nation Theater, which is our Central Vermont professional theater, put Lyddie on the stage. And that was a very exciting night for me. The directors decided that they needed to bring the whole cast, and it's a cast of 20, and all the crew down to Lowell a couple of weeks ago to soak in the atmosphere, and they felt like they had been truly inspired to be in the real place, and they did a wonderful production. It was very imaginative. I couldn't figure out how you did bears, how you did machines, how you did stagecoaches, but they figured it out in a very imaginative way, and I won't spend time talking about it, but it was fun. So as much as I enjoyed that, and as thrilling as it was to see Lyddie on the stage, it's even more thrilling to be in Lowell, because I'm at a place where the true story of Lowell's past is well known. And to have Lowell and the History Center, and I suppose Dr. Parker, if he were around, and the university welcome my fictional girl in this historic setting is a real thrill for me. I can't remember when I wasn't interested in the past. Like many children, I love to hear stories of my parents' childhood. I referred to that time long ago as the olden days. When my own children began to ask about my childhood, they used a different expression. They would say, "Back when you were alive, Mom." I'm alive, I'd exclaim. But my children were not convinced. As far as my childhood was as far away from their time as the Ice Age. And a few years back, I was reading a list of recommended books of historical fiction and found on it not my novels set in 12th and 18th century Japan or 19th century China, much less 19th century New England, but I found Jacob Have I Loved. How could Jacob be classified as historical fiction, I asked myself. That takes place back when I was alive. Well, now, of course, even Bridge to Terabithia and the Great Gilly Hopkins are set in the late 1970s, and they are rapidly heading towards historical status. Fortunately for me and writers like me who continued to write years after they were alive, historical fiction is gaining a bit more respect than it had when I started out as a writer. It was not always so. I remember one conversation with a librarian who lamented the fact that the master puppeteer was set in 18th century Japan. If you're just taking the same story, she said, and set it in this country, children would be able to enjoy it so much more. I tried to imagine how I might have a story set in the Bunraku Theater of Osaka in the 18th century, take place in today's Chicago. It just boggled the mind. I know Leonard Bernstein set Romeo and Juliet in 20th century New York City, but it seemed different somehow. That conversation reminded me of another friend who chided me for making Gilly Hopkins 11 years old. If you hadn't given her a specific age, my friend said, so many more children could have identified with her. Now, my feeling is that there are certain givens in life, one of which is that everyone has a birthday. A character with no birthday cannot exist as a human being. If Gilly had had no birthday, no one would have been able to identify with her. because she would have been totally unreal. Real characters not only have birthdays, they live in actual periods of history. The more details we seek to remove from a novel in order to keep it from seeming dated, the more likely we are to remove elements that make the story true to the reader. If what I've written in a piece of contemporary fiction is real, by the time I lift my pen from the final page or type the end on the screen, my story's already on the way to becoming historical fiction. This came home to me in the fall of 2001. In August, I had sent a book to my editor, Virginia Buckley, which by my definition was contemporary fiction, set in Vermont in the summer, fall, and winter of 2001. I had no idea when I was writing it in 2000 that the fall of 2001 would be a watershed of history, that any book set during those months would have to deal somehow with the tragic events of 9/11. But those events were so horrendous that they would have taken over the story that I was trying to write, and my story would no longer be possible. So I took the easy way out. When I revised, I pushed my story back to the summer of 2000. The wrenching story of 9/11 would no doubt be tackled by other writers in the near future, but not by me, and certainly not in that particular book. And if I look at the way I write, I seldom deal directly with events that are so immediate. I will instead look at them through what I've called the spectacles of historical fiction. History gives us a pair of powerful eyeglasses with which to examine our own times. It is hard to look directly at our present reality because we are both too myopic and too faint-hearted. I began my career as a novelist for young people writing about feudal Japan. My first two books are set in that momentous period of Japanese history when civil war is tearing the nation apart. It was a time of political intrigue, assassination, and corrupting power. My third book is set in a period of plagues and famines where the rich are becoming richer and the poor are rising up in violent street rebellions. These books were written between the years 1968 and 1975. Some of you can remember what was going on in our country during that time. For those of you too young to recall those good old days, let me give you a brief review. The Vietnam War had become such a national nightmare that both Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy announced their intention to run against Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination for president. On March the 31st, 1968, Johnson announced his decision not to run again. 4 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Within hours, Washington, D.C., the city I lived one block outside of, exploded into riots. Federal troops were ordered into Washington, Chicago, and Baltimore. We were still in shock when a Jordanian Arab assassinated Bobby Kennedy on network television. Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia and were met by rock-throwing students. In Chicago, police and demonstrators clashed, disrupting the Democratic National Convention and somehow making the gallant warrior of the oppressed, Hubert Humphrey, seem like a villainous warmonger. And the country, writhing in what seemed like mortal agony, chose Richard Nixon to lead us into health and wholeness. And that, friends, was only the first year of that tumultuous period. I've never written a book set in 1968. How could I? I can hardly bear to recite the events that occurred that year. But when I began my first novel, the book I was writing because I was homesick for Japan, I chose to set it in the middle of the 12th century, a time of devastating civil disturbance and wasteful war. If I was writing out of love for Japan, why didn't I write about the 11th century, the golden age of literature and the arts? I could have shared with young Americans the wonders of that period. But instead, I set my books at the end of the Heian period, when the sword had gained dominance over the chrysanthemum, when the warrior had more honor than the artist. The word Heian is made up of two Chinese characters, both of which carry the meaning of the English word peace. And most of the Heian era was peaceful, the prosperous flowering of a great civilization. But I didn't choose to write about that. And the fact that I didn't betrays me. It wasn't Japan I loved so much as it was my own country. My own country was tearing itself apart. Somehow, I had to look at that. So out of the history of Japan, I chose the periods that might help me make sense of my own time and place. The same thing happened when I began to write about China. I was born in China and spent most of my first 8 years there, but I wasn't ready to set a book in China until the early 1980s. So why, out of the more than 4,000 years of Chinese recorded history, did I choose that brief, less than quarter century of the Taiping Rebellion, when I finally decided to write a book set in the country of my birth? Since Rebels of the Heavenly Kingdom is one of my least read books, perhaps I need to tell you about the Taiping Rebellion of the late 19th century. The Taiping was, first of all, a religious movement, a mixture of Christianity and native Chinese religions. The Taiping were opposed to any sort of oppression, slavery, foot binding, prostitution, polygamy. They did not kill, steal, use alcohol or opium, or bow down to graven images. They believed that every child, male or female, had a right to education, and that women as well as men could own property and hold positions of leadership. All of this in 1850, when in America we were arguing whether God had ordained some to be slave owners and others to be slaves. I was fascinated by the Taiping. Where had they gotten these ideals, and what had become of them? I was led into the tragic story of what happens when persons of high ideals take them into a holy crusade. One of the early and basic declarations of the Taiping was, you should not kill one innocent person or do one unrighteous act, even though it be to acquire an empire. When they embarked on their campaign to conquer China, which of course entailed the killing of many innocent people and the committing of untold unrighteous acts, they had to devise some justification for this behavior. The simplest justification was to regard their enemies as less than human, and therefore outside the province of the high God. Chinese had traditionally regarded non-Chinese as less than human. The Taiping followed this old prejudice. The Manchu and whoever supported or sided with the Manchu dynasty were less than human. Demons, in fact. One cannot be faulted for ridding the world of demons. They are by definition enemies of God, and whoever would honor God must hate God's enemies, or so the reasoning went. I don't have to fill in for you the consequences of such thinking. History has applied it over and over again. But this is not just the problem of the Taiping, or more currently, Islamic terrorists. Remember, I was writing the book back in the days when the Soviet Union was the evil empire. And this appellation was justifying many covert operations by the CIA around the world. It sent us into Central and South America to overthrow governments. That is why we supported Muslim fundamentalist guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan. We abandoned the devastated populace once the Soviets withdrew and reaped the whirlwind less than 10 years later. Every person, as well as every nation, seeks to dehumanize the adversary. We kill the nameless foe and discover all too late, as Oedipus did, that we have killed members of our own family. The wonderful British writer Jill Peyton Walsh said once that if you want to know what a period of history was like, don't read the contemporary fiction of that period. Read the historical fiction written in that period. Which, when she said that, I realized was true of the fiction I was writing. It was set in the past, sometimes hundreds of years in the past, but reflected the turmoil of the world in which I lived. And now we come to Lyddie. In Lyddie, I moved from Asia to 19th century New England. I began to write Lyddie as I began to write most of my books because I was excited, not because I knew anything about Vermont in the 1840s or about the mills of Lowell, Massachusetts during that period. I mean, I grew up in the South where the Industrial Revolution was the cotton gin. I knew nothing about the fabric mills of New England. One of the earliest dictums beginning writers here is, write about what you know. And when someone said that to me, I thought, but if I write only about what I know, I would never write. I don't know anything. I write to find out. The question people ask me most often is, where do you get your ideas? And the answer is, anywhere I can. Ideas are always a problem for me. I'm not like some of my writer friends who have drawers full of ideas, so many ideas that they'll never live long enough to write them all. When I finish a book, I think, well, that was a nice career while it lasted. Then, if by some miracle an idea does flit across my mind, I snatch at it and examine it closely. Is it worth all the trees? I ask myself. Someone told me years ago how many trees it takes to print a modest version of a book, and I was so appalled, I immediately forgot the figure. But I do remember that it was such a forest that I dare not toss off any old thing. Trees are far too valuable to take their loss lightly. And then there's my own life. Nearly 20 years ago, when I turned the youthful age of 60, my friend Stephanie Tolan sent me a birthday card that said, on your 100th birthday, with congratulations and best wishes for your happiness. And inside she'd written, what? You say this is not your 100th birthday? Sorry, my mistake. Put this card someplace safe until it is appropriate to the year. Well, the appropriate year is getting closer all the time. So in addition to the trees that will be used up when my book is published, I have to think of the year or two or three that it will take me to write it. This cuts down considerably on the ideas I'm willing to tackle. After I'd finished Park's Quest and was searching for another idea that would meet these standards, I saw in the local paper a notice of a conference that looked promising. The Vermont Women's History Project was sponsoring a day-long meeting to encourage women in the arts to commit themselves to projects that would highlight the place of women in Vermont's history. Vermont would be celebrating its bicentennial in 1991, and the idea was that these projects would be published or presented in time for the bicentennial year. The current governor, Madeline Kunin, was scheduled to be the luncheon speaker. Now, when I move to a new place, as I have more times than I care to remember, I'm always desperate for friends. I went to the conference not only because then Governor Madeline Kunin was to speak, but secretly hoping to meet congenial women, and secondarily to learn more about my newly adopted state. But perhaps there was a tickle in the back of my mind that maybe, just maybe, I might stumble upon an idea worth writing. I chose the workshop that I went in because it was being co-led by a 6th grade teacher in whose class I had spoken, and I knew Mary would be nice to me. I tend to be shy at this kind of gathering. During the course of the afternoon, one of the other leaders read aloud letters written by Vermont farm girls who had gone to the factories of Massachusetts and New Hampshire to work. They were wonderful letters, full of homesick longing for the mountains and farms of Vermont, and rich with vivid detail about their new lives. The spelling was what we call today inventive. I heard those letters and my flesh literally crawled. Live young women jumped out of them to me. Why hasn't anyone written a novel about these wonderful women, I asked myself, and then was very careful not to check books in print to see if anybody had. Well, excitement over a book idea lasts just until I hit the brick wall of reality, which for me is when I realize that this is indeed a wonderful idea for someone else, someone who knows something about the subject at hand. Time out for a few days of cleaning up the old mail pile or making pies while I wonder why I ever went into the book business. Then with a deep sigh, I make a trip to the library to try to find out something, anything about the subject. Also to prove to myself that living where I do, research will be all but impossible. At this stage, I have a terrible handicap. I'm really a very shy person. I cannot bring myself to discuss my project with another human being. So I went to the library to begin to work on Lyddie. I would not even talk with the librarian about what I was looking for. This personality defect means I wasted a lot of time. It also meant that in the basement of the Vermont Historical Society, I met Abby Hemingway, who related a story about a bear that got transformed into the bear story in Lyddie. No one would have sent me to that particular book if I could have explained exactly what I was looking for. So there's an upside to being dense and inarticulate. You find out things quite by accident that turn out to be very valuable. By making it as hard for myself as I possibly can, I do this research. Then I sweat through the initial draft. Now, the best way to trick myself into doing the first draft of a book is to say, look, relax. This isn't it. This is only the stupid first draft. It's guaranteed to be awful. It's supposed to be awful. The only requirement is to get it down at all. Any way you can do it is okay. Just get to the end. And actually, any end will do for now. Just get there. There are days when I'm absolutely stuck, either because the material is too painful or I'm sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am not and will never be worthy of this magnificent idea. Those days, I just say, 2 pages. That's all you have to do. The margins can be as wide as you like. Just get down 2 pages and you can get up and do something else. Finally, by tricking myself on a regular basis, I get this big messy pile of paper, this lump of a book. Now I know how awful it is, but by this time I've been working on it for a year, or sometimes 2. And my poor husband, John, who is sitting there trying to make sure I'm talking loud enough for everybody to hear, my poor husband, John, has only had vague hints as to the general subject matter when I tremblingly hand it over to him to read. It finally dawned on me how frightening this occasion must be for John. I mean, suppose he has to come out of the den and announce to me that I have spent the last year or more of my life producing garbage. Well, anyhow, he didn't. Not that time. thank God, and as my grandmother used to say, I speak reverently. But he did come out of the room with several pages of notes. I had already been to the Shelburne Museum and to the National Industrial Park in Lowell, but now we'll have to go back again to Lowell to look more carefully, and to the American Textile Museum, where I will actually learn how to tie a weaver's knot and go through the motions of starting a 19th century loom. All of John's notes will set me on the rewriting, and that must be done before the book will be sent to Virginia Buckley, my editor since 1970, who doesn't know anything about this book yet. I've managed to say I'm working on something which, because it is connected to Vermont's bicentennial, I hope will be published in by 1991. And she said, but first you have to send it to me. That's far more than she usually knows about a work in progress, poor dear. When Virginia finally saw Lyddie, she wrote me a letter, 6 full single-spaced pages, in addition to all the notes written directly on the manuscript. I reread most of that letter while I was writing this speech, and I realized how much rewriting I did of this book. One thing I think I've learned over the last 40-some years is that historical fiction stands or falls on the rewriting. The more research you've done, the more you have to rewrite to bury that research. In the early stages, the writer is still making the scene clear to herself. But the manuscript is very awkward, all knees and elbows sticking out. If the reader's impressed by the amount of research the writer has done, then the writer has, in a real sense, failed. I want the reader to be so caught up in the story, to have people in place so alive to the reader, that she will race to the end of the book to find out what happens to these people. If she or even he stumbles on the furniture, it won't matter if it's authentic, although the reader is sure to stumble if the writer is not comfortable or got it wrong. And there always seems to be that one vital bit of information that no expert wants to supply. I had to find out. The entire plot depended on it. When, in 1846, the petition for the 10-hour workday was presented to the Massachusetts legislature. If any of the authors of the books I read knew, they weren't telling. No one at the Textile Museum knew. They sent me to the Massachusetts State Library, which sent me to the State Archives, which sent me to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. The document was in the archives, but without a date of submission. I spent at least 2 days on the telephone. Finally, the researcher at the University Library said, well, you have to figure it was before May. They were all citizen legislators. They'd have to go home to plant their crops come spring. There'd be no point in presenting a petition after the legislature had adjourned for the year. That made perfect sense. And the Vermont legislature is still run on that pattern. And that is why Lyddie did not sign that petition, after all. She would have if it had been presented in the fall, but I could not fight history. And thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche says, one must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star. That's a particularly comforting quotation, by the way, when you're reading through the first draft of your latest novel. No chaos, no dancing star. After Lyddie, I wrote a book that took me back to late 20th century Virginia, but then in those dark days of no ideas, a strange image came into my mind out of nowhere. It was a picture of a small child falling off a wagon, and no one comes back to look for him. After that book was finished, but before it was published, a lady asked me what my new book was about. It was time I realized that I would have to start talking about my new book. I find being a grown-up in these matters exceedingly difficult, so I have to practice answering politely. So, what's your new book about? I shuddered, then pulled myself together. Okay, here goes, I thought, but the words didn't come out nearly as politely as I meant for them to. I guess I have to start talking about it sooner or later, I said. Now, oh dear, what should I say that won't make my beloved book sound totally stupid? Okay, I said finally, I guess I can tell you where it came from. The questioner perked up with great interest, so I went on. I had this image of a child tumbling off the back of a wagon, and nobody comes back to look for him. Oh, she said brightly, there's another book that starts just like that. I froze. See, that's why you should never talk about what you're working on. I was crushed. Another book that begins just like my dear, fragile, yet unborn one? How could that be? She searched around in her mind for the title. Pecos Bill, she said finally. Doesn't it begin just like that? A child falls off the back of the wagon, then is rescued by the coyotes and raised by them? I didn't know what I said after that. At least there were no coyotes in my book. Oh, well, the question of where a book comes from is not one that can be answered in a sentence or two. One idea, as I often say to school classes, one idea doth not a novel make. Not even Jip. I started with the boy tumbling off the back of the wagon, but that led to an investigation of why such a thing should happen. I have 2 boys and 2 girls. The girls are generally well behaved, but the boys would tumble off of anything. But I can't imagine a little further down the road not noticing I was missing a child or 2. And noticing it, I cannot imagine not going back and hunting until I found them. Why should such a thing happen? When I began writing on Jip, it sounded as though I had the beginning of an adventure story. And it seemed to me, when I had on my critics rather than my writer's hat, that there was a dearth of really good adventure stories around. I went back to reread some of the classics, books the like of which we haven't seen for a long time. I started with Huckleberry Finn and went on to Great Expectations, Treasure Island, and finally to Kidnapped. It was Kidnapped that simply drove me back to my own book. What a story. Stevenson really knew how to do it. And for days I floated about, inflated with Stevenson's language, pacing, characterization, wild Highland setting. I was little more than a Stevenson wannabe. But then I came thudding back to earth. I was not Robert Louis Stevenson. I could not write like him, nor in truth did I want to. As much as I admired Kidnapped, I did not want to rewrite it. I wanted to write a book that only I could write. I wanted to set my book in the hill country of Vermont, not the Scottish Highlands. I wanted to bring to life that child who rolled off the wagon, the child no one came back to look for. Who was he? Why had he been abandoned? And why did he seem so precious to me? As I began to explore, I learned more about him, his almost mystical way with animals and people in need, his common sense, his hardworking nature. And then reading for setting and atmosphere, I met another person in the basement of the Historical Society in Montpelier, so compelling that I knew his story and Jip's were meant to entwine. I was reading a town history of Hartford, Vermont, when in a section telling about the town poor farm, I came across a paragraph about a man named Putnam Proctor Wilson. Wilson was one of 2 lunatics for whom the town had built wooden cages on the poor farm. These men, the writer says, were raving crazy most of the time, and they're caged up like wild beasts in narrow, filthy cells. I often saw them in their pitiable condition, was impressed with the conviction that inhuman treatment to which they were subjected was sufficient of itself to make lunatics of all men. Poor old Putnam had some rational moments and was always pleased to see children to whom he would sing the old song, "Friendship to every willing mind," as often as requested. So I took poor Putnam Wilson, named him Put Nelson, and gave him a new song and my already beloved boy, Jip. I knew Jip would give Put not just pity, but just genuine love and friendship. At some point, and I'm not just sure when it was, characters from my earlier New England novel quietly began to congregate. I was glad to see them again, of course, but since I don't write sequels, I felt the need to tell them that it wasn't their story, and there probably wasn't a place for them in it. They were very pleasant about it all, just hung around the edges and watched. For a long time I worked doing more research than actual writing, still unable to figure out where Jip had come from, and thus what must happen to him for the mystery of his beginnings to be solved. One morning I woke up. At last, I had a plot. I knew where he'd come from. You'd think I'd rejoice, but no. My first reaction was surprised irritation, almost anger. How could that be the explanation? That would not be the rollicking adventure story I'd planned to write. I struggled against the revelation for a while and finally gave up. People think writers have infinite choices to make when constructing a book. In truth, I feel that we have very few. Usually the story is whether to complete the story or not. I chose to write it. I was too much in love with Jip and Put to let them go. It was about this point that Luke Stevens and Lyddie Worthen stepped out of the wings, saying in effect, there, don't take on so. We're here, we'll help, and don't think of it as a sequel. This is Jip's story, not ours. And then there's Preacher's Boy, my tip of the hat not to Stevenson, but to Mark Twain, who happens to be my first cousin 4 times removed. When I began to write, my America was in the middle of millennium madness. What I wondered was happening at the turn of the last century. I read memoirs of that time and went through so many newspapers on microfiche that my eyes blurred and my head pounded. What I found, sadly, was that many of the problems facing Americans in 1899 had not gone away in the past 100 years of civilization's halting march. War, poverty, homelessness, ignorance, and all the attendant prejudices still flourished. The marvelous utilization of electricity, the telegraph, the telephone, even the automobile had not made the world a better or safer place. I put my boy into the midst of that imperfect but hope-filled setting and gave him something every child needs but too few possess, a pair of wise and loving parents. His father's a preacher, and here I was playing against stereotypes. For not only are good fathers rare in today's fiction, a wise and loving Christian minister belongs to an endangered species. By the way, some of you may know that I'm the daughter of a minister and that my husband is the son and grandson of ministers. And this July, I will have been married to a minister for 50 years. We have 4 children, all of whom grew up as children of a minister. And in case you're wondering, Preacher's Boy is entirely a work of fiction, and any resemblance to any actual persons living or dead is pretty much. I came to Lowell yesterday from Lawrence, where I've been joining in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the famous 1912 labor strike that we now call the Bread and Roses strike. I wish I could have been in Lowell on April 10th when you folks saw a film and talked about the connection between Lowell and that historic event. I missed that program, but even so, I'm well aware that workers in Lowell were among the first to send help to the strikers in Lawrence. As part of the celebration, folks in Lawrence have been reading my other book related to labor history, Bread and Roses 2, which is a tribute to the heroism of the Lawrence workers and to the generosity of those other workers, especially those in my hometown of Barre, Vermont, who came to their aid during that terrible and amazing winter. And again, like Lyddie, it is a mirror of our own time, where the struggle of the working poor for a living wage is far from won, and the greed of the wealthy 1% seems insatiable. My story begins in Lawrence in 1912, when about 26,000 textile workers from more than 30 countries, speaking at least 45 languages, united in what has become known as the strike for bread and roses. And while the numbers and name of the strike are in dispute, the heroism of the strikers is not in doubt. I first became interested in this bit of history when I saw a picture taken in my town. Standing on the granite steps of the old Socialist Labor Hall in Barrie are 36 children and 4 adults. The caption below the picture reads, "Children from the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike come to Barrie." There's a story in that picture, I said to myself, and then set about to finding out what the story was. If there were ever unlikely heroes in the world, surely the textile workers of Lawrence in the winter of 1912 are among them. We have to assume that the very reason the mill owners of Lawrence went to the poor regions of Europe to recruit them from so many countries speaking so many languages was that so they could have very cheap labor that would never unite in a strike. It was a sort of a Tower of Babel in reverse. You begin with a babel of voices and build your empire upon their inability to communicate. But it is the marvel of this seldom told story that those 26,000 textile workers banded together in the dead of winter to march, sing, and protest until at length they won every concession they demanded of the at least temporarily humbled owners. There are arguments about where the name of the strike came from. In Italy, there was a labor slogan, "Pan et Rose." It could well have come from that, but the legend is more colorful, and legend has it that during those interminable days of marching, some anonymous worker had carried a placard that read, "We want bread and roses too." How could you not want to write about people, most of them women, many of them children, who even when they are starving, want more than simply nourishment for their bodies. People who long for beauty in the midst of squalor. By the time I had immersed myself in the story of the strike, I was overcome with admiration. I wanted to tell the world about them. My only fear was that I would not be able to tell a fictional story worthy of their historic triumph. But fiction is what I do. I write stories for children and young people, and it is up to the reader to judge whether I succeeded in telling a tale worthy of their history. I think of myself as more of a reader than a writer. And so the thing I love most about writing is that it gives you readers. Readers who will take the simple story that you have written and turn it into something quite wonderful. When I was in the midst of writing Lyddie, I met a special group of readers who, I am sure, influenced my writing in a profound way. This is the way it happened. The adult basic education in the state of Vermont started a rather wonderful program 25 or so years ago. New adult readers are invited to join book discussion groups. The discussions are based on a theme: home, friendship, courage, history. At each meeting, 3 books will relate to the theme: a picture book, an easy reader, and a young people's novel. The students are to choose the book that matches their reading ability, and everyone is able to discuss the theme based on what they have read. It sort of broke down because everybody wanted to read every book, and so if they couldn't read the novel, they would bully their tutors into reading it out loud to them. In 1989, the new literates in Rutland had a great idea. Through their book discussions, they had come to love books. Let's have a celebration, they said. Let's invite the students from all over the state, choose one book that everyone will read and discuss. The book they chose was The Great Gilly Hopkins, and because the author just happened to live in the state and Barbara Bush was not available, I was invited to speak at the celebration. The Vermont Council on the Humanities, IBM, and of course Ben & Jerry's were enlisted to provide money for the big event. The owner of a ski resort motel offered his beautiful facilities, but would anyone come? More than 300 students and tutors came from all over the state, even though it meant for many of them missing a day's wages, taking a bus at dawn to meet with strangers, and not incidentally to reveal to 300 other people that you had just learned how to read. When the invitation to speak was given to me, the director said, Katherine, I think I'd better tell you, most of these people have never heard a formal speech in their lives. It took me a minute to figure out what it was that Sally was trying as tactfully as possible to say to me. Oh, I said, I think you're saying I shouldn't have a speech written out the way I always do. I'm afraid so, she said. A librarian friend drove me to the Cortina Inn over the mountain along curving back roads by a river. I am not given to motion sickness, but believe me, I was close to vomiting from fright, and it was not Grace's driving. I had an hour and a half to fill and no prepared manuscript. I could say everything I knew off the top of my head in about 10 minutes. What if my mind went totally blank? I alternated during that long early morning drive between fits of giggles and intense, if silent, prayer. Oh God, let me get through this without making a fool of myself. Now, I have not in my long Presbyterian life had many experiences when I could say that I heard the voice of God. But I seemed to that day. And what I thought God said was, shut up. This is not your day. And when I shut up and forgot about my fear, I had one of the most amazing days of my life. It was an audience a politician would die for. They hung on every syllable. They laughed at every joke. If I asked a rhetorical question, someone was sure to answer at length. The leaders had to bully us to stop at the end of the hour and a half, while the audience was still standing to give their testimonies to the power of books, to challenge and heal their lives. These people gave me themselves because they had read Gilly's story and they identified with her hurt and anger. They loved her, and by extension, they loved me because I had somehow given her to them. As I turned back to the story I was trying to write, set in the Vermont of the 19th century, of course, my growing friendships with adults just coming into the joy of reading was very much on my mind. Lyddie, like many of my new friends, had to take on the responsibilities of adulthood while still a child. She, like they, had to struggle against terrible odds, and despite her lack of schooling, determined to read for herself a book a friend had read to her and that she had loved. Still, even as I wrote the book, I felt sad. It was going to be too difficult. It would be inaccessible to the very people who had inspired much of its writing. But I believe strongly that a book teaches you how it ought to be written, and I was trying to obey the dictates of the story. I would wreck it if I tried to tailor it to a particular audience. As it turned out, I was wrong, as I often am. For the third year of celebration of People in Books, Lyddie was one of 5 books relating to Vermont history that participants might choose to read and discuss. In honor of Vermont's 1991 bicentennial, the Shelburne Museum, which is our answer to the Lowell National Park, provided elegantly written and printed study guides to each book, relating the contents of the book to what participants would see as they toured the various buildings and exhibits on the Shelburne grounds. More than 500 people came, and of those, more than 100 new readers chose to read and discuss Lyddie. One of the participants, Delphia Lupian, said I might share some of her reflections on that wonderful day. My teacher, Barbara Plouffe, Delphia said, is the one who encouraged me to read Lyddie, and I'm glad that she did. Lyddie is a lot like me because I don't know how to read very well. And Lyddie had a hard time too. But Lyddie is more like I would like to be. I really did have such a wonderful time that day at the Shelburne Museum. The museum brought Lyddie to life. I want to thank you for spending the day with us and writing and autographing such a wonderful book. I really had a great day. I can't remember when I had such a wonderful day. I didn't want the day to end. As I got ready for this week in Lawrence and Lowell, I had to think about my two heroines, Rosa and Lyddie. In some ways, they're very different. Rosa's the more privileged. She gets to go to school. She's allowed to be a child while her mother and sister must support the family, and ultimately strike to demand not a living wage, but at least one that will keep them from starving. Lyddie has to be the adult. We see her struggling first on the farm, then in the tavern, and finally in the mill, trying to redeem the family farm. She would certainly understand Rosa's fear of the strike. She doesn't want anything to stand in the way of her making the money she needs. Signing a petition for fairer working conditions would certainly jeopardize that. But they both need something more than just bread. They both need roses. Lyddie wouldn't perhaps be conscious of this. She's too dogged determined to do her duty. But then one night, she comes back from the mill, too exhausted to eat, only to have a story feed her soul. Betsy did not give any explanation of the novel she was reading, simply commenced to read aloud where she had broken off reading to herself. Even though Lyddie's head was still choked with lint and battered with noise, she struggled to get the sense of the story. The child was in some kind of poorhouse, it seemed, and he was hungry. Lyddie knew about hungry children, Rachel, Agnes, Charlie. They had all been hungry that winter of the bear. The hungry little boy in the story had held up his bowl to the poorhouse overseer and said, "Please, sir, I want some more." And for this, the overseer, she could see his little rosebud mouth rounded in horror. For this, the overseer had screamed out at the child. In her mind's eye, little Oliver Twist looked exactly like a younger Charlie. The cruel overseer had screamed and hauled the boy before a sort of agent. And for what crime? For the monstrous crime of wanting more to eat. "The boy will be hung," the agent prophesied. "I know that boy will be hung." She fought sleep, ravenous for every word. She had not had any appetite for the bountiful meal downstairs, but now she was feeling a hunger she knew nothing about. She had to know what would happen to little Oliver. Would he indeed be hanged just because he wanted more gruel? She opened her eyes and turned to watch Betsy, who was absorbed in her reading. Then Betsy sensed her watching and looked up from the book. "It's a marvelous story, isn't it? I saw the author once, Mr. Charles Dickens. He visited our factory. Let me see, I was already in the spinning room. It must have been in..." But Lyddie cared nothing for authors or dates. "Don't stop reading the story, please," she croaked out. "Never fear, little Lyddie, no more interruptions," Betsy promised, and read on, though her voice grew raspy with fatigue, until the bell rang for curfew. She stuck a hair ribbon in the place. "Till tomorrow night," she whispered, as the feet of an army of girls could be heard thundering up the staircase. The next day in the mill, the noise was just as jarring, and her feet in Tryphina's old boots swelled just as large. But now and again, she caught herself humming. "Why am I suddenly happy? What wonderful thing is about to happen to me?" And then she remembered. Tonight, after supper, Betsy would read to her again. She was, of course, afraid for Oliver, who was all mixed up in her mind with Charlie. But there was a delicious anticipation, like molded sugar on her tongue. She had to know what would happen to him, how his story would unfold. Diana noticed the change. "You're settling in faster than I thought," she said. But Lyddie didn't tell her. She didn't quite know how to explain to anyone that it wasn't so much that she had gotten used to the mill, but she'd found a way to escape its grasp. The pasted sheets of poetry or scripture in the window frames, the geraniums on the sill, those must be some other girl's way, she decided. But hers was a story. And so is mine. And I thank you. We did stagecoaches, but they figured it out in a very imaginative way, and I won't spend time talking about it, but it was fun. So as much as I enjoyed that, and as thrilling as it was to see Lyddie on the stage, it's even more thrilling to be in Lowell, because I'm at a place where the true story of Lowell's past is well known. And to have Lowell and the History Center, and I suppose Dr. Parker, if he were around, and the university welcome my fictional girl in this historic setting is a real thrill for me. I can't remember when I wasn't interested in the past. Like many children, I love to hear stories of my parents' childhood. I referred to that time long ago as the olden days. When my own children began to ask about my childhood, they used a different expression. They would say, "Back when you were alive, Mom." I'm alive, I'd exclaim. But my children were not convinced. As far as my childhood was as far away from their time as the Ice Age. And a few years back, I was reading a list of recommended books of historical fiction and found on it not my novels set in 12th and 18th century Japan or 19th century China, much less 19th century New England, but I found Jacob Have I Loved. How could Jacob be classified as historical fiction, I asked myself. That takes place back when I was alive. Well, now, of course, even Bridge to Terabithia and the Great Gilly Hopkins are set in the late 1970s, and they are rapidly heading towards historical status. Fortunately for me and writers like me who continued to write years after they were alive, historical fiction is gaining a bit more respect than it had when I started out as a writer. It was not always so. I remember one conversation with a librarian who lamented the fact that the master puppeteer was set in 18th century Japan. If you're just taking the same story, she said, and set it in this country, children would be able to enjoy it so much more. I tried to imagine how I might have a story set in the Bunraku Theater of Osaka in the 18th century take place in today's Chicago. It just boggled the mind. I know Leonard Bernstein set Romeo and Juliet in 20th century New York City, but it seemed different somehow. That conversation reminded me of another friend who chided me for making Gilly Hopkins 11 years old. If you hadn't given her a specific age, my friend said, so many more children could have identified with her. Now, my feeling is that there are certain givens in life, one of which is that everyone has a birthday. A character with no birthday cannot exist by the writers in the near future, but not by me, and certainly not in that particular book. And if I look at the way I write, I seldom deal directly with events that are so immediate. I will instead look at them through what I've called the spectacles of historical fiction. History gives us a pair of powerful eyeglasses with which to examine our own times. It is hard to look directly at our present reality because we are both too myopic and too faint-hearted. I began my career as a novelist for young people writing about feudal Japan. My first two books are set in that momentous period of Japanese history when civil war is tearing the nation apart. It was a time of political intrigue, assassination, and corrupting power. My third book is set in a period of plagues and famines where the rich are becoming richer and the poor are rising up in violent street rebellions. These books were written between the years 1968 and 1975. Some of you can remember what was going on in our country during that time. For those of you too young to recall those good old days, let me give you a brief review. The Vietnam War had become such a national nightmare that both Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy announced as a human being. If Gilligan had no birthday, no one would have been able to identify with her because she would have been totally unreal. Real characters not only have birthdays, they live in actual periods of history. The more details we seek to remove from a novel in order to keep it from seeming dated, the more likely we are to remove elements that make the story true to the reader. If what I've written in a piece of contemporary fiction is real, by the time I lift my pen from the final page or type the end on the screen, my story's already on the way to becoming historical fiction. This came home to me in the fall of 2001. In August, I had sent a book to my editor, Virginia Buckley, which by my definition was contemporary fiction, set in Vermont in the summer, fall, and winter of 2001. I had no idea when I was writing it in 2000 that the fall of 2001 would be a watershed of history, that any book set during those months would have to deal somehow with the tragic events of 9/11. But those events were so horrendous that they would have taken over the story that I was trying to write, and my story would no longer be possible. So I took the easy way out. When I revised, I pushed my story back to the summer of 2000. The wrenching story of 9/11 would no doubt be tackled by It's really a joy to be in Lowell tonight, and I appreciate all you all coming out in the uncertain weather. And I suppose you live close enough around that the driving here doesn't drive you crazy. But if it hadn't been for Seth yesterday, we would still be wandering around somewhere on the other side of the river. So maybe I can write, but I can't find my way around. Certainly not around the hole. So it is a special joy to have finally gotten here. I feel as though Lyddie and I have been a part of the National Park and the History Center, well, since there was a History Center, right? And just last week in Montpelier, the Lost Nation Theater, which is our Central Vermont professional theater, put Lyddie on the stage. And that was a very exciting night for me. The directors decided that they needed to bring the whole cast, and it's a cast of 20, and all the crew down to Lowell a couple of weeks ago to soak in the atmosphere, and they felt like they had been truly inspired to be in the real place, and they did a wonderful production. It was very imaginative. I couldn't figure out how you did bears, how you did machines, how you